The auction block stood in the center of Congo Square, and on it stood a man whose shadow fell across 12 rows of seated bidders. 7 feet and 3 inches of muscle and bone, hands that could palm a watermelon like an apple, shoulders that had carried cotton bales meant for 2 men. The auctioneer's voice cracked when he called the opening bid. $3,000, a fortune in 1852. But the woman in the third row, silver hair pinned beneath a black lace veil, rings on every finger, widow's weeds that cost more than most men earned in a year, raised her paddle without hesitation. 4,000. The crowd gasped, the auctioneer stammered, and in the back of the square a clerk opened a leather-bound ledger and made a notation that would, over the next 18 months, be repeated 21 more times. His name was Solomon. Born on a rice plantation outside Charleston in 1825, sold south at 14 when his first owner died and the estate was liquidated. By the time he reached New Orleans, he had been through 7 different hands. Each sale recorded in meticulous detail: height, weight, estimated age, condition of teeth, scars from whippings, capacity for labor. But there was another notation that appeared in the margins of these documents, written in different hands but always with the same careful attention. Unusual effect on women of certain age and station. Before we go further, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what you're about to hear is a story that appears in no textbook, no historical survey, no museum exhibition. It exists only in the fragmented records of estate sales, probate courts, and the private correspondence of New Orleans society in the 1850s. If we don't preserve these stories, if we don't share them, they disappear. So subscribe. And when you're done with this video, I want you to comment with your city and state. Let's see how far this story reaches. Let's build a community of people who refuse to let these histories die. Now, back to Solomon and the widow in the third row. Her name was Marguerite Devereux, 53 years old, widow of a cotton factor who had died 2 years earlier, leaving her a mansion on Esplanade Avenue, a summer house in Mandeville, and a fortune estimated at $70,000. She had no children, no close family, and according to the whispered gossip of New Orleans society, no interest in remarrying. What she did have was a pattern. Every 6 to 8 weeks, she would appear at the slave auctions in Congo Square. She would bid only on one type of man, tall, powerfully built, dark-skinned, between the ages of 25 and 35, and she would pay whatever price was necessary to win the auction. Solomon was her 14th purchase. The system that made this possible was intricate and brutal. Louisiana law in 1852 granted widows complete control over their deceased husbands' estates, provided there were no male heirs. This was unusual for the time. In most states, a widow's property passed to male relatives or was held in trust. But Louisiana, operating under Napoleonic Code, recognized women's independent property rights in ways that Anglo-American common law did not. For wealthy widows, this meant absolute power. They could buy, sell, and dispose of property, including human property, without any man's permission. And in New Orleans in the 1850s, there were many such widows. Yellow fever epidemics swept through the city every summer. Men who worked in the cotton trade, who spent long hours in the humid warehouses along the river, who negotiated deals in crowded coffee houses and auction houses, died at rates that left their wives suddenly, shockingly wealthy and alone. The city had entire neighborhoods where black-clad women lived in enormous houses, with only their enslaved servants for company. Marguerite Devereux was one of dozens, but she was notable for the frequency of her purchases and the speed of her resales. The pattern was always the same. She would buy a man at auction. He would be delivered to her house on Esplanade Avenue. He would remain there for 6 to 8 weeks, Then he would reappear at auction, and Marguerite would buy again. The men she sold were always in perfect physical condition, well-fed, unmarked by whipping or punishment, but there was something in their eyes that the traders noticed. A hollowness, a distance. One auctioneer described it in his diary as the look of a man who has seen something he cannot speak of. Solomon's first sale to Marguerite happened in March of 1852. He was delivered to the house on Esplanade Avenue on a Tuesday morning. The house was 3 stories, built in the French colonial style, with galleries that wrapped around each floor and gardens that stretched back towards the swamp. Inside, the rooms were furnished with imported furniture from Paris, carpets from Persia, paintings in gold frames. Marguerite met him in the entrance hall. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, and she had to tilt her head back to look at his face. She walked around him slowly, the way you might examine a horse. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost gentle. "You will call me Madam. You will live in the garçonnière behind the main house. You will come when I ring the bell. You will leave when I dismiss you. You will speak to no one about what happens in this house. Do you understand?" Solomon understood. What choice did he have? The garçonnière was a small building at the back of the property, traditionally used to house adolescent sons or male guests. It had a bed, a chair, a washstand. Marguerite had it stocked with clothes that fit him. Fine clothes, linen shirts and wool trousers, leather shoes. She had meals brought to him 3 times a day. Chicken, rice, vegetables, bread, coffee, more food than he had seen in years. For the first 3 days, she did not summon him. He waited, he ate, he slept in a real bed for the first time since childhood. And he wondered what price he would pay for this comfort. On the 4th night, the bell rang. What happened in Marguerite Devereux's bedroom is not recorded in any document, but we can construct the outline from what we know. From the letters that other widows wrote to each other, using coded language that they thought protected them from scandal. From the testimony of enslaved women who worked in these houses and who, years later, spoke to interviewers from the Federal Writers Project. From the medical records of doctors who treated these women for ailments that had no physical cause but were nonetheless real. From the probate records that show, again and again, the same pattern. Wealthy widow, isolated household, frequent purchases of young men, rapid resales. The widows were buying companionship, but not the companionship of conversation or shared meals. They were buying bodies. They were buying the right to touch and be touched. They were buying the simulation of intimacy without the complications of marriage, without the loss of independence, without the social scrutiny that would come from taking a lover of their own race and class. They were buying human beings and using them as instruments of their own desire. And because the law defined enslaved people as property, because the law granted these women absolute control over that property, because the law recognized no crime in what an owner did with her own slave, they could do this openly. They could walk into Congo Square and bid thousands of dollars for a man's body, and no one could stop them. Solomon spent 6 weeks in the garçonnière, 6 weeks of being summoned in the night, 6 weeks of being touched by hands that shook with need and rage and loneliness, 6 weeks of performing a role that had no name, that existed in the gap between slavery's legal framework and its unspoken possibilities. Marguerite never hit him, never raised her voice. She fed him well, clothed him well, and when she was done with him, she sold him. The second buyer was named Céleste Robichaud, 58 years old, widow of a sugar planter. She paid $3,500. Solomon spent 7 weeks in her house on Chartres Street. Then she sold him. The third buyer was Amélie Fontenot, 51 years old, widow of a banker. She paid $3,200. Solomon spent 8 weeks in her house in the Garden District. Then she sold him. By the time Solomon had been sold for the 10th time, The pattern was known throughout New Orleans. The traders joked about it. The widow's circuit, they called it. A man could spend years being passed from house to house, never working a field, never feeling a whip, living in comfort and horror. Some men broke under it. They became docile, empty, compliant. They stopped speaking unless spoken to. They moved through the world like ghosts. Others became dangerous. They attacked their owners or tried to run or killed themselves. The traders learned to watch for the signs. A man who had been through the circuit too many times was a bad investment. He might snap at any moment. Solomon did not break, and he did not snap. Instead, he began to pay attention. He noticed that the widows all knew each other. They visited each other's houses for tea. They attended the same church. They sat in the same box at the opera. They were a network, a community, bound together by wealth and loss and the secret knowledge of what they did in the dark. He noticed that they kept records. Marguerite had a book where she wrote down every purchase, every sale, every expense related to her household. She left it on her desk sometimes, and Solomon learned to read the numbers upside down while he stood waiting for her instructions. He noticed that the widows trusted their enslaved servants in ways that other owners did not. They had to. The servants knew everything. They prepared the rooms, changed the sheets, brought the meals. They were witnesses to transactions that could never be spoken of openly. And Solomon noticed that some of the servants were angry. There was a woman named Hélène who worked in Amélie Fontenot's house. She was in her 40s, light-skinned, the daughter of a Creole woman and a French merchant. She had been enslaved since birth, but she could read and write, and she had contacts throughout the city's free black community. She and Solomon spoke in the kitchen one morning while Amélie was still asleep. Hélène's voice was low and bitter. They think they're different from the men who rape girls in the quarters. They think because they pay money, because they don't use whips, because they feed you well, it's not the same thing. But it is the same thing. You know it. I know it. And one day, everyone will know it. Solomon asked her what she meant. Hélène smiled. It was not a kind smile. There are people in this city who are keeping records, real records, names, dates, amounts. Every widow who buys a man for this purpose, every sale, every resale. When the time comes, and it will come, those records will be evidence of what these women really are. The time did not come in Solomon's lifetime, but the records survived. By his 15th sale, Solomon had developed a strategy. He would be compliant but not broken. He would perform the role expected of him without losing himself inside it. He would observe, remember, and wait. He did not know what he was waiting for. Freedom seemed impossible. Escape from New Orleans meant crossing hundreds of miles of hostile territory with no resources and no allies. But he refused to become the hollow-eyed ghost he had seen in other men. He would survive. And if survival meant enduring the touch of women who saw him as an object, a tool, a piece of property to be used and discarded, then he would endure. The 16th buyer was named Octavie Blanchard. She was different from the others, younger, only 49, and newly widowed. Her husband had died just 3 months earlier, and she was still raw with grief. She bought Solomon for $4,000, the highest price he had commanded since Marguerite's first purchase. But when he arrived at her house on Dauphine Street, she did not summon him to her bedroom. Instead, she had him work in the garden, planting roses, trimming hedges, carrying water. For 2 weeks, she barely spoke to him. Then, one evening, she called him into the parlor. She was sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at the street. She did not look at him when she spoke. My husband was a good man. He was kind to me. We had 30 years together, and now he's gone, and I don't know what to do with myself. I bought you because that's what women like me do, but I don't want what the others want. I just don't want to be alone. Solomon stood silent. What could he say? Octavie continued, I'm going to sell you, not because you've done anything wrong, but because keeping you here, knowing what you must think of me, knowing what I'm part of, I can't bear it. I'll take a loss on the sale, I don't care. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all of it. She sold him 2 days later for $2,800, a significant loss. The buyer was Marguerite Devereux, his 17th sale. He was back in the Garçonnière on Esplanade Avenue, back in the same bed, the same room, the same nightmare. Marguerite greeted him like an old friend. I knew you'd come back to me, she said. They always do. This time, Solomon stayed for 9 weeks, longer than any previous stay. Marguerite was aging, her hands shook more. Her breath came harder. She clung to him in the dark with a desperation that felt like drowning. And when she finally sold him, she did something she had never done before. She wrote him a letter. She gave it to him the morning he left, pressed it into his hand, and told him not to read it until he was alone. He waited until he was in the wagon being transported to the auction house. Then he unfolded the paper. The handwriting was shaky, but legible. Solomon, I know what I am. I know what I have done to you and to the others. I tell myself that I am kind, that I treat you well, that I am not like the men who use their power to inflict pain. But I know the truth. I am worse, because I pretend that what I do is something other than what it is. I pretend that because I pay money, because I do not use violence, I'm somehow innocent. But I am not innocent. I am a monster, and I will die a monster. I wanted you to know that I know. I wanted you to know that I am sorry. It changes nothing, but I wanted you to say it. Marguerite. Solomon burned the letter. He did not want evidence of her guilt. He did not want her apology. He wanted his freedom. But freedom did not come. The 18th sale, the 19th, the 20th. Different widows, different houses, same pattern. By the 21st sale, Solomon was 30 years old. He had been on the widow's circuit for nearly 2 years. He had lived in a dozen different houses, been touched by a dozen different women, been sold and resold until he had lost count of the transactions. He was still physically strong. The widows fed him well, and he was never subjected to the brutal labor that broke men's bodies in the fields. But something inside him was eroding. He could feel it. A slow dissolution of self, a gradual loss of the boundary between who he was and what he was forced to be. The 21st buyer was named Sylvie Marchand, 62 years old, widow of a ship's captain. She had been buying men for 5 years, longer than any of the others. She had a reputation among the traders as a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and would pay top dollar for it. She bought Solomon for $3,900. He was delivered to her house on Royal Street on a Friday afternoon in November of 1853. The house was smaller than the others, darker, filled with heavy furniture and the smell of old perfume. Sylvie met him at the door. She looked him up and down with the practiced eye of someone who had done this many times before. Then she said something that surprised him. "You're tired. I can see it. You've been through too many houses. You're starting to break. I've seen it before. Some men last longer than others, but they all break eventually. You're close." Solomon said nothing. Sylvie continued, "I'm going to make you an offer. You can refuse if you want, but I don't think you will. I'll keep you for 6 months, longer than anyone else has kept you. And at the end of 6 months, I'll sell you to a man I know who runs a boarding house for free black sailors. He needs workers, strong men who can lift cargo, manage the docks. It's hard work, but it's honest work, and he's willing to look the other way if a man decides to slip onto a ship heading north. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Solomon understood. Sylvie was offering him a chance. Not freedom, she could not give him that, but a path toward it. A way out of the circuit, a possibility of escape. The price was 6 months in her house. 6 months of being what she needed him to be. 6 months of endurance. He agreed. Those 6 months were the longest of Solomon's life. Sylvie was not cruel, but she was demanding. She wanted him available at all hours. She wanted conversation as well as physical presence. She wanted him to sit with her while she read, to walk with her in the courtyard, to listen to her talk about her dead husband and her lonely life. She wanted the illusion of a relationship, and Solomon gave it to her. He played the role. He smiled when she wanted him to smile. He listened when she wanted him to listen. He touched her when she wanted to be touched. And he counted the days. On the 180th day, Sylvie kept her promise. She sold him to a man named Jacques Thibault, who ran a boarding house on Chupatula Street near the docks. The sale price was $1,500, a steep loss for Sylvie, but she did not seem to care. She shook Solomon's hand when he left, a strange, formal gesture, and told him, "You're stronger than I thought. Most men would have broken. Use that strength. Get out of this city. Don't let them catch you." Jacques Thibault was a free man of color, a rarity in New Orleans, but not unheard of. He had bought his own freedom 20 years earlier and had built a successful business catering to the sailors and dock workers who passed through the port. He employed both free and enslaved men, and he had a reputation for treating them fairly. When Solomon arrived, Jacques took him aside and spoke plainly. "I know where you came from. I know what you've been through. Sylvie told me. She's done this before, bought men off the circuit and sent them to me. Some of them stay, some of them run. I don't ask questions. You work for me, you get fed, you get a place to sleep. If you decide to leave, you leave at night, and you don't tell me where you're going. Understood?" Solomon worked at the boarding house for 4 months. He loaded cargo, repaired buildings, served meals to the sailors who came through. He saved every penny he could earn or steal, and he watched the ships. He learned which ones were heading north, which captains were sympathetic to runaways, which routes were safest. In March of 1854, a ship called the Meridian docked in New Orleans. It was bound for Philadelphia. The captain was a Quaker named Elias Morton, known among the free black community as a man who would, for the right price, look the other way when a stowaway appeared on his ship. Solomon approached him one night in a tavern near the docks. He offered him everything he had saved, $63. Elias looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Be at the dock at midnight. Bring nothing. If anyone asks, I've never seen you." Solomon was at the dock at midnight. He climbed aboard the Meridian and hid in the cargo hold among barrels of sugar and cotton bales. The ship left New Orleans before dawn. For 3 weeks, Solomon lived in the dark, eating scraps that Elias smuggled to him, drinking water from a tin cup, listening to the creak of the ship and the voices of the crew above. When the Meridian docked in Philadelphia, Elias came down to the hold and told him, "You're free now. Legally, you're still a fugitive, but you're in a free state. There are people here who will help you. Go to the African Methodist Episcopal Church on Lombard Street. Ask for Reverend Turner. Tell him Elias sent you. He'll take care of you." Solomon walked off the Meridian on a cold April morning in 1854. He was 31 years old. He had been enslaved for his entire life. He had been sold 22 times. He had endured things that had no name, that existed in the shadows of a system that defined him as property and gave his owners absolute power over his body. And now he was standing on a dock in Philadelphia, breathing free air for the first time. He went to the church. He met Reverend Turner. He was given clothes, food, a place to stay. He was introduced to the community of formerly enslaved people who had made Philadelphia their home. He learned to read and write. He found work as a laborer, then as a carpenter. He married a woman named Sarah who had escaped from Virginia. They had 3 children. He lived in Philadelphia for 41 years. He died in 1895 at the age of 72. Before he died, Solomon told his story to a journalist named Frederick Douglass Jr., the son of the famous abolitionist. The interview was published in a small abolitionist newspaper in 1894, but it was largely ignored. The country was tired of slavery stories by then. Reconstruction had failed. Jim Crow was rising. The nation wanted to move on, to forget, to pretend that the horrors of slavery were ancient history. Solomon's story, with its uncomfortable truths about women's complicity, about the ways that power and desire and loneliness could twist into something monstrous, did not fit the narratives that people wanted to hear. But the records survived. In the archives of the New Orleans notarial records, you can find the bills of sale, 22 transactions, 22 times that Solomon was bought and sold. The names of the widows are there: Marguerite Devereux, Celeste Robichaud, Amélie Fontenot, Octavie Blanchard, Sylvie Marchand, and 17 others. Their signatures are on the documents, written in careful script, legal and binding. Evidence of what they did. Evidence of a system that allowed them to do it. In the letters and diaries of New Orleans society, women from the 1850s, there are references to the practice. Coded language, euphemisms, hints. Madame X has made another purchase. The widows are quite active at the auctions these days. It is a comfort to have companionship in one's declining years. No one spoke of it directly. No one acknowledged what was really happening. But everyone knew. In the testimony of formerly enslaved people, collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, there are stories. An old woman in Alabama who remembered her mother telling her about the widows of New Orleans. A man in Mississippi who said his uncle had been on the circuit and had never recovered from it. Fragments, pieces, echoes of a practice that was widespread enough to be known, hidden enough to be deniable. And in Solomon's own words, recorded in that 1894 interview, there is this: people want to believe that slavery was only about cotton and sugar and tobacco, that it was only about labor, but slavery was about power, absolute power, the power to buy and sell human beings, the power to use them however you wanted, the power to define them as things, as property, as objects without will or desire of their own. And that power corrupted everyone who held it, men and women, rich and poor. It didn't matter. If you had the power, you used it, and the law protected you. The law said you could do whatever you wanted as long as you owned the person you were doing it to. That's what slavery was. That's what people need to understand. It wasn't just a labor system. It was a system of absolute power. And absolute power is always monstrous. Solomon's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. It forces us to acknowledge that women, too, were complicit in slavery's horrors, that wealth and loneliness and desire could combine to create new forms of exploitation, that the legal framework of slavery enabled abuses that went far beyond the plantation, that the buying and selling of human beings created markets for every kind of human need and want, no matter how twisted. It also forces us to confront the resilience of the people who survived. Solomon endured 22 sales. He endured 2 years on the widow's circuit. He endured the erosion of self that came from being treated as an object, a tool, a thing, and he survived. He escaped. He built a life. He raised a family. He lived to be an old man. He told his story, and even though that story was ignored in his own time, it survived in the archives, waiting for someone to find it, to read it, to share it. That's what we're doing here. We're finding these stories. We're reading them. We're sharing them. We're refusing to let them be forgotten. Because if we forget, if we allow these histories to disappear, then we lose something essential. We lose the truth about what slavery really was. We lose the evidence of how power operates, how systems of oppression function, how human beings can be both victims and perpetrators. We lose the stories of resistance and survival that prove that even in the darkest circumstances, people find ways to endure, to hope, to fight for their freedom. So here's what I want you to do. First, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. We're building a community of people who care about these stories, who refuse to let them die. Second, share this video. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Post it on your social media. Talk about it with your friends and family. Third, comment below with your city and state. Let's see how far this story reaches. Let's create a map of people who are committed to remembering. And finally, I want you to think about this. What other stories are hidden in the archives? What other truths are waiting to be uncovered? What other voices are waiting to be heard? Solomon's story survived because someone wrote it down, because someone preserved the records, because someone cared enough to keep it alive. How many stories didn't survive? How many people endured horrors that left no trace, no record, no evidence? How many lives were erased completely? We can't bring those people back. We can't undo what was done to them, but we can honor them by refusing to forget. We can honor them by seeking out the stories that did survive, by sharing them, by learning from them. We can honor them by building a world where such horrors are impossible, where no human being can ever again be defined as property, where power is checked and limited and held accountable. That's the work, that's the mission. And it starts with stories like Solomon's, stories that are uncomfortable, that challenge our assumptions, that force us to confront the full reality of our history, stories that prove that the past is not past, that its echoes are still with us, that we are still living with the consequences of choices made 200 years ago. Solomon died in 1895, but his story lives. And as long as we keep telling it, as long as we keep sharing it, as long as we keep refusing to forget, he lives too. Not as a victim, not as an object, but as a man who survived, a man who resisted, a man who claimed his freedom and built a life and left a legacy, a man whose story matters. Remember his name, remember what was done to him, remember what he overcame, and remember that his story is not unique. There were thousands like him, tens of thousands, people whose names we will never know, whose stories were never recorded, whose suffering left no trace, but they existed, they lived, they endured, and they deserve to be remembered. That's why we do this work. That's why these stories matter. That's why we can't stop telling them, sharing them, fighting to keep them alive. Because memory is resistance. Memory is justice. Memory is the foundation of a better future. So subscribe, share, comment, and most importantly, remember. Remember Solomon. Remember the widows who bought him. Remember the system that made it all possible. Remember the people who survived it. Remember the people who didn't. Remember that this is our history, all of us, and we have a responsibility to face it honestly, to learn from it, and to build something better. What will you do with this story? How will you honor Solomon's memory? How will you contribute to the work of remembering, of truth-telling, of justice? The choice is yours, but the story is ours, all of ours, and it's waiting for you to carry it forward.